Hi everyone, Chris here for the History Geeks. Today I am at the Jerome Township Soldiers Memorial right outside of Dublin, Ohio, and today is Veterans Day. So this is actually a very interesting location why we are here for the ceremony today to honor our nation's veterans. Because it was here in a place that was called New California. During the Civil War, after Abraham Lincoln made his call for volunteers to help suppress the rebellion in the southern states, almost all able-bodied men and boys of this township volunteered and signed up to fight. Well, by the end of the war, 75 of them would be dead. Now that would be 75 people out of a total population of only 1,400, which is 19% of the entire town's population killed during the American Civil War. So that gave the town of New California here in Jerome Township the distinction of having the highest casualty rate per capita of any town or city in the entire United States during the Civil War. So in 1913, the people of the town decided to honor their memory and erect this statue here, which we will see a little later on in the program. But first, let's talk a little bit about Veterans Day. So Veterans Day actually originated after the end of World War I, and it was originally called Armistice Day. Now, the armistice was the end of the conflict of World War I, and it was signed on the 11th day of the 11th month on the 11th hour, so at 11 a.m. is when World War I officially ended. Now, Europe was embroiled in this war for 4 long years. The United States only got in about the last year or so, but still played an integral role in this war. So World War I was so devastating, and millions of men died in the disease-infested and cold and muddy trenches on places like the Western Front. And so at the Armistice Day was marked by wearing red and orange poppies on your lapel. And in fact, today, if you look at the news and around the world, many people in France and Great Britain and Canada are still wearing those poppies for Armistice Day, but not the United States. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But why were they wearing the poppies? Well, it's because of a famous poem written by a soldier of World War I after he was attended the funeral of one of his friends. I'd like to share that poem with you for a second. It's called "And Flanders Fields." And Flanders fields the poppies blow, between the crosses, row on row, that mark our place, and in the sky, the larks still bravely singing fly, scarce heard amid the guns below. We are the dead. Short days ago we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders fields. Take up our quarrel with the foe. To you from the failing hands we throw the torch, be yours to hold it high. If you break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders fields. And that is why they wear the poppies on their lapels in remembrance. Well, let's fast forward to World War II. So in the 20-plus years in between the end of World War I and World War II, the United States did celebrate Armistice Day. After World War II, we had a problem. We had 16.1 million people, men and women, who were in the armed forces during World War II. So, and over 400,000 died in World War II. So how do we honor these men and women who fought in the greatest conflict the world had ever seen, the most terrible destruction in the history of the entire world? Over 100 million people are estimated to have died worldwide. So it was not only one of the darkest moments in world history, but it was sort of the defining moment in American history. America saw themselves as saviors of the free world, and America became the superpower of the world. How do we honor their memory? And so after World War II, we changed Armistice Day to Veterans Day. So this solves a couple of problems. It honors all of your World War II veterans. It also honors all of your veterans, including World War I, all the way down through the Revolutionary War, who have fought and died for the freedoms that we enjoy today. So that is how Armistice Day became Veterans Day, which we, of course, still celebrate to this very day. And we're going to see the program here, so let's take a look.
Morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is CJ Lovejoy. I'm the head of the Board of Township Trustees. We'd like to thank you for coming out today for the 2017 Veterans Day ceremony. Mr. Joe Kraft, he's also one of the other trustees here today. I want to give thanks for all our veterans that stopped out today, and thanks for all the veterans that have served our country. I want to, if you're a veteran, please raise your hand. Let's give them a round of applause, ladies and gentlemen. Also want to thank our local law enforcement officers for being out here today. I'm going to turn it over to Pastor Earl Dunbar.
Welcome. I am proud to be the pastor at New California here. And in our church we have a plaque, and I'd like to read that to you before we pray. I'm not getting it? Okay. Okay. Hold on. So it says April 24th, 1861. On this site, in the former sanctuary of this congregation, the first meeting in Jerome Township was held to respond to the call of President Abraham Lincoln for volunteers to defend the Union against the Confederacy. On the pulpit were the Bible and the munitions of war. The Reverend B.D. Evans, a Presbyterian minister, delivered a stirring patriotic address. The first man to enlist was David O. Taylor, who 3 years later would be killed on the battlefield in Dallas, Georgia. The oldest man to volunteer was a Scotsman, Walter Gowans, who was more than 60 years old. In all, over 40 volunteers came forward that night, and before the war was over, 367 men from Jerome Township served the Union cause. Of that number, 75 fell in the service of their country.
My honor and privilege to introduce our Veterans Day speaker. He is remembered for his character, honest Abe, and his leadership, his speeches and letters, and is a man of humble origins. He issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which began the process of freedom to America's slaves. It was his decision to fight to preserve the Union, resulting in the USA remaining one nation. In fact, his face is etched in this historic monument. Ladies and gentlemen, the 16th President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln.
Thank you, Doug. We are here today to honor our veterans of the United States military service. Some people ask, why should we honor our veterans? We all know why, because freedom isn't free. The men and women who wear the uniform of the United States Armed Forces have paid the price over and over and over again for the freedoms we all enjoy. Whether stationed in the United States or in outposts all over the world, They have protected and defended the United States of America and our interests against all foreign enemies since the beginning of our country's history in 1776. And it is for this that we need to pause and give thanks to our veterans, not just on this Veterans Day, but on all 365 days of the year. Anytime we encounter a veteran, we need to take the moment to shake that veteran's hand and thank them for their service and for our freedom. The most difficult time to serve as president is at a time of war, when men are fighting and dying for our country. As Commander-in-Chief, it is my responsibility to have to send our soldiers into harm's way, where they may be wounded or they may give their lives. I have often had to write letters of condolence to family members of deceased servicemen. I would like to share one of the letters that I wrote to Mrs. Lydia Bixby of Boston, Massachusetts, a widowed mother of 5 sons who died for the cause of liberty in this war. I wrote, "Dear Mrs. Bixby, I have given a statement that you are the mother of 5 sons who have died gloriously on a field of battle. I feel how weak and fruitless must be any words of mine that would attempt to beguile you from the grief of a loss so overwhelming. But I cannot refrain from offering you the consolation that may come from the grateful thanks of the Republic they died to save. I pray that our Heavenly Father may assuage the grief, I pray that our Heavenly Father, I've got a mind blank here. I pray that our Heavenly Father may assuage the anguish of your bereavement and leave you only the cherished memories of the loved and lost, and a solemn pride that must be yours for having laid so costly a sacrifice upon the altar of freedom. Sincerely yours, Abraham Lincoln." You may not know it, but I too am a veteran. Back in 1832, an Indian chief by the name of Black Hawk brought members of his tribe out of Indian territory back across the Mississippi River into the state of Illinois in what was known as the Black Hawk Indian War. Our state governor ordered the local militias to mobilize and help drive the Indians back to Indian territory. As a patriotic young 23-year-old citizen, I volunteered for the Sangamon County Militia. It was customary in those days for a local militia to elect its own leader, and I'm proud to state my mates elected me the leader of the Sangamon County Militia, so I began my military service with the rank of captain in the United States Army. Now, how's that for starting out well up in the ranks? But along with the rank of captain came the responsibility for conducting the military drills, a skill in which I was sorely lacking. One day we were marching across a field in ranks of 4 abreast and approaching a fort, and I noticed the gateway was quite narrow and would only allow us to pass through in ranks of 2 abreast. But I could not recall any command to collapse the ranks from 4 to 2 abreast, but thinking quickly, I called out the command, "Company, halt!" followed by the command, "Company, dismissed," with the added instruction, "Company will reassemble in 5 minutes on the other side of the gate." That series of commands worked quite nicely, but I must confess that during my short enlistment, I did not engage in any actual skirmishes with the hostile Indians, but I did wage many a bloody battle with the infernal and insidious Illinois mosquitoes. When I was a young man, I thought I was the ugliest man on the face of the earth, an opinion that was shared by others, including some who were friends of mine. One was an old farmer friend. He came to me one summer and said, "Mr. Lincoln, you're not only ugly looking, you're downright scary looking. In fact, you're so scary looking, I fashioned my scarecrow in your exact image this summer. And when I put that ugly, scary looking scarecrow out in my cornfield, it has scared my crows so badly they now brought back all the corn they stole the previous summer." Did you know that I was the first president to proclaim Thanksgiving a national holiday? Now, Thanksgiving was celebrated before I became president in some states and some communities, in honor of the Pilgrims and their contribution to our nation's heritage, but those celebrations were not always held at the same time and they were not coordinated. But after our success at the battles of Gettysburg and Vicksburg in July 1863, I thought it would be appropriate to set aside a single day when we could all pause as a nation, give thanks to our God and our Maker for our many blessings. You know, in those days we did not have a Veterans Day, and this was my opportunity to allow the nation to give thanks to our veterans for the service they were providing in this war with the rebellious states. So I issued a presidential proclamation setting aside a day in November 1863 as the first National Day of Thanksgiving. Now, along with this, I also would become the first president to pardon a turkey. Now, a couple of weeks before this Thanksgiving Day, a farmer friend gave us a nice, large, plump, live turkey that we could keep and serve for our Thanksgiving dinner. Well, my youngest son, 9-year-old Tad, was a great lover of animals. He already had a stable on the grounds of the president's home in which he kept a pony and a goat and a lamb and some chickens and some cats and dogs. Well, he quickly adopted this turkey in his menagerie. He played with the turkey every day. He named his turkey Jack. Well, a couple of days before Thanksgiving, Tad was out on the lawn playing with Jack the turkey, and the cook passed by, called out to him, "You know, Tad, you shouldn't get too attached to that old turkey, because I'm going to cook him and we're going to eat him for Thanksgiving dinner." Well, you can imagine, Tad made a beeline to my presidential office. He burst right in the middle of a cabinet meeting. He said, "Father, cook says we're going to eat Jack for Thanksgiving dinner. You can't let that happen. Jack is my friend. Father, you have the authority to pardon soldiers who have been condemned to be executed. Can't you use that same authority and pardon Jack?" Well, I took one look at those big, sad puppy dog eyes and that tear-streaked face, and I did what any father might do. I took a piece of my stationery. I wrote upon it, "I, President Abraham Lincoln, do hereby pardon Jack the turkey." I handed it to Tad, and he strutted out of my office, secure in the knowledge that Jack would now live a normal, long, happy turkey life. And we would eat ham for our Thanksgiving dinner that had been donated by some poor pig that none of us personally knew. I'd like to wrap up now by sharing with you a little bit about the key battle of the war. I did assume the presidency in March of 1861 at the most difficult time in our country's history, a time when we would separate into two and we would fight a war between the states. This was a war to dissolve the Union or a war to reunite the Union. It was a war to abolish slavery or a war to expand slavery. It was a war to preserve an old way of life in the South or a war to create a new way of life. It was a war to determine whether the United States Declaration of Independence and our Constitution still meant anything at all to our country and whether our nation could even survive. In the middle of this awful war, two of our greatest armies would meet in battle on fields in and around the tiny Pennsylvania town of Gettysburg, in a battle that would determine much of the course of the remaining 2 years of the American Civil War. For 3 days, from July 1st to July 3rd of 1863, 90,000 Union troops in the Army of the Potomac under General George Gordon Meade would battle with 80,000 rebel troops of the Army of Northern Virginia under General Robert E. Lee in a couple of dozen engagements on these fields around Gettysburg. After these 3 days of bloody and intense fighting, more than 8,000 men lay dead on the battlefield. 23,000 more had been wounded, and an additional 20,000 had been captured or were missing in action, a casualty count of 51,000 men in just 3 days, the highest casualty count of any battle of the entire war, and representing almost 1/3 of the total men engaged in this 3-day battle. Thoroughly exhausted, General Robert E. Lee and his Army of Northern Virginia, early on the morning of July 4th, began retreating south back towards Virginia, ceding the battlefield and the victory to the Union Army. From that day forward, for the remainder of the war, no major Southern army could mount a serious offensive campaign, and for the remaining 2 years they would be pursued and chased by various Northern armies until, beginning in April 1865, one by one they would be surrounded and forced to surrender, and the war would end. the governor of the state of Pennsylvania suggested that we create a new national cemetery near the battlefield of Gettysburg to inter the dead. He scheduled a ceremony for November of that year to dedicate that cemetery, and I was invited to say a few words of dedication. I accepted that invitation, and I will now share and conclude this presentation by reciting that speech that I first gave on November 19th, 1863 at the cemetery at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here, consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, living rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. I thank you. May God bless America. May God bless our veterans. Thank you.
How's this sound? All right. Okay. Hello, everyone. Well, I am here, of course, with the 16th President of the United States. He is our honored guest today. Mr. President, thank you so much for being with us today. Appreciate it.
It's my pleasure to be here.
So now, we heard your remarks about Veterans Day and why Veterans Day is so important. You are a great storyteller. So, people know you because of your iconic beard, amongst other things, right? Could you tell us a story? How did you get your beard?
Okay, what most people don't know is that I am the first president to wear a beard, and also I did not have any beard for most of my life. It was only when I was running for president at the age of 51 that I considered growing a beard. And it was an 11-year-old girl. Her name was Grace Bedell. She lived in Westfield, New York, and she's the one who gave me the suggestion. Now, little Grace had never personally met me, but she saw my very thin face on a campaign poster in New York State. She wrote me a letter. She said, "Dear Mr. Lincoln, your face is so thin it would look so much better if you had whiskers. Now, all the ladies like whiskers, and they would tease their husbands to vote for you. And if you say you'll grow whiskers, I'll tell my daddy and my brothers to vote for you. And I have 5 brothers. Well, I thought that sounded like a lot of extra votes.
Makes sense.
In New York State, that would be important to my election, so I wrote back, "Dear Grace, if you think something silly like whiskers would actually make my face look better, then I just might grow some." And when I was elected president in November 1860, I allowed my whiskers to grow. And 3 months later, in February, I took a train to Washington for my inauguration, and my beard had filled out to something similar to what you see today. My train would stop in many towns along the way where I gave little speeches, but I made sure we would stop in Westfield, New York, where we had told Grace's parents to meet us at the station. When I got off the train, I called out to the audience, "There's a young lady here I'd like to meet. There's Grace Bedell here." Well, the crowd parted, and little Grace came forward. I leaned down and invited her to tug on my whiskers, which she did. Then I asked her, "Well, little lady, what do you think of my whiskers?" And she said, "Mr. President, it's a mighty fine set of whiskers you have there. It really does make your face look so much better." And if you go to Westfield, New York today, on their town square, there's a statue of me waiting to greet Grace, and her standing in front of me with some flowers she would give me before she tugged on my whiskers to commemorate that occasion. And you can actually say an 11-year-old girl has literally changed the face of history.
That's right. That is a wonderful story. Now, you've had many accomplishments in your administration, right? You are constantly rated as one of the greatest presidents of all time. I'm interested to know, what do you feel is your greatest accomplishment as President of the United States?
My greatest accomplishment, and I said it when we did this, I said, if history remembers us for anything, it would be for this event, and that was the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863. Now, there's a lot behind that document. I had no authority as president by the Constitution over the institution of slavery. It was the states' rights issue. However, in the middle of this war, I used what's called the war powers of the president to issue the Emancipation Proclamation that says the president can take any action he deems necessary to diminish the capacity of an enemy to wage war against the United States. And so I attacked the Southern economy by threatening their slavery institution through the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, the primary purpose of the document was not to emancipate slaves, but actually to try to encourage or entice the Southern states to quit the war and return to the Union rather than risk losing their slavery. The key phrase said, as of January 1st, 1863, any slave of any master in a state in rebellion against the United States will be free and will remain forever after free. We issued it in preliminary form 100 days earlier on September 22nd, 1862, giving the Southern states 100 days to consider the consequences of their action with the hope some would quit the war. If so, the Emancipation Proclamation would not apply to them, as it did not apply to the 4 loyal border slave states that had stayed in the Union. However, none of those states did so. So I signed a document in January 1st, beginning the process towards eventual abolition of slavery in the entire United States that would occur in 1865. However, my critics assailed me and said, you know, Mr. President, you attempted in this document to free slaves where you had no current authority in the South, and you did nothing about slavery in the North. But they didn't understand that the document had other purposes as well, and that's what, if you got a few moments, I'd like to tell you what it really accomplished. The second purpose of the Emancipation Proclamation was to keep England and France out of the war. Both England and France had been threatening in 1862 to recognize the South as an independent and sovereign nation in order to trade with them for Southern cotton, which they needed to fuel their textile industries. From the time the war began in 1861, we had imposed a naval blockade of key Southern ports such as Wilmington, Charleston, and Savannah, preventing European ships from entering those ports and trading for cotton. As long as those ports belonged to the United States, we could do with them as we pleased. But if Europe recognized the South as an independent nation and we continued to blockade those ports, we would be in violation of international law. and that would be considered an act of war, and it would entitle England and France to send their powerful navies to our shores to break up the blockade. And if that happened, they would certainly provide supplies and financial assistance to the South, and possibly even send troops to fight on their side against the North, and this would have tipped the balance of power in the war. But by issuing the Emancipation Proclamation, I officially made the purpose of the war the abolition of slavery. Both England and France had abolished their own slavery in the 1830s throughout their worldwide empires, and their governments were strongly opposed to slavery in any form. If they now chose to recognize the South as an independent nation, they would be endorsing the institution of slavery, something their governments did not want to do. So they stayed neutral, they stayed out of the war, the balance of power was not affected. No country in the world ever recognized the South as an independent nation. That purpose of the Emancipation Proclamation worked. The third and equally important part was to resolve an issue of what to do with the 100,000 slaves that were now in Union possession. As we conquered territory in the South and freed plantation slaves, and as slaves ran behind Union lines to escape, we gathered them up and put them into slave camps throughout the North and along the East Coast and captured territory all the way down to South Carolina. We had to hold those slaves in camps until the end of the war, when they would be returned to their masters in the South because of a law passed in the 1850s called the Fugitive Slave Law that said that any slave that escaped into free territory had to be returned to its master. That law was still in effect in 1862, so those slaves would have had to be returned at the end of the war. But when I issued the Emancipation Proclamation, with its phrase that said, all slaves of masters in a state that is in rebellion against the government will be free on January 1st, I effectively voided the fugitive slave law for those southern rebellious states and instantly freed those 100,000 slaves. So my critics who said I freed no slaves were completely wrong. I freed 100,000 slaves on that day, and as we captured more territory during the war, we would free additional slaves continually for the remainder of the war. But I took it one step further. I wrote a second phrase into the Emancipation Proclamation that said, these newly freed slaves will now be allowed to serve in the Union Army so they could fight for their perpetual freedom. Now, why was that important? Prior to 1863, a free black man in the North who came to the recruiting station to join the Army was turned away. We had a policy that prohibited black men from serving in the Army. I decided to test that policy and used the newly freed black slaves, particularly in the South Carolina region, to create the first United States Colored Troops, or USCT, to see how they could perform. Well, they performed so valiantly that within a few months we changed our policy in the North and we began accepting all black men into the service, whether they be freedmen or newly freed slaves, and tens of thousands rushed to the recruiting office, and by the end of the war, more than 180,000 black men had served in the United States Colored Troops, representing more than 10% of our entire Union Army, and these numbers enabled us to keep our numerical superiority over the South and directly contributed to winning the war. So the fact that we kept England and France out of the war and we created the United States Colored Troops made the Emancipation Proclamation the most important document I would issue, and it became probably the first major turning point in the war with the South.
Absolutely one of the most important documents in our nation's history. Thank you very much for spending a few minutes talking to us, Mr. President. Okay. We appreciate it. We learned a lot. That's it for this episode of the History Geeks from the Jerome Township Soldiers Memorial on this Veterans Day. Thanks again to all the veterans who have served our country, both in the past and in our present times. Today, we're going to leave you with a speech that Colonel W.L. Curry gave at the dedication of this Soldiers Memorial in 1913. Take care, and we'll see you next time. Some of your boys, my fellow citizens, fought on almost every great battlefield of the war. They were at Gettysburg, Chickamauga. They were at Shiloh, Stone River, Cheat Mountain, Port Republic, Antietam, Vicksburg, and many of the battlefields of Virginia. They were in the 100 days under fire from Chattanooga to Atlanta. Some of them marched with Sherman to the sea, and others were at Appomattox at the surrender of Lee's army. This is the true story of the service of the soldiers of this township to whom you pay tribute. From the address by Colonel W.L. Curry.